It's time for the first challenge of intermediate month, so hopefully this wasn't too much of a step up in difficulty, but there were certainly some new techniques introduced. So the first one of these starts all the way in the intermediate step with this source row number field, which is included for files, so CSVs or Excel files, and by default it's turned off, so when you input the data it looks like this. But to enable that, all you need to do is simply right click on the field and say include this field, and it's just numbering those rows of your data set in the order that they come in. So we can take a look at how that's affected that. You can just see that source row number there being 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. And if we look at particular staff IDs, we realise that they have more than one row. And that's because an employee's pay has changed. So this person potentially went from full-time to part-time in some way. That is quite a reduction of salary, but let's not scrutinise the numbers too much. It is fake data after all. So to find that latest row of data, I went to the source row number field and went on the more options menu and went to create calculated field and chose a fixed LOD. And to create that calculation, I want to find the latest source row number, so the highest source row number. So I changed that min to a max. And then I want to group that for each staff ID, so that for each staff ID, we're finding the latest row in the data set for them. So then, for example, if I look back at this staff ID number 1007, then I can see that the latest row ID number has been returned here in this calculation 1. So now I just want to filter my data set to only include this latest row. So in other words, where source row number equals calculation 1. So let's apply a filter there. So filter those values so that calculation 1 equals source row number, and then I'll be left with only the rows that I need. So 803 rows should be remaining. Now, I've already applied those changes in this step here and gone ahead even and deleted the source row number and the latest row fixed LOD that I've created. And so this should be how my data is looking after applying those steps. Next up, we need to add up these columns 1 to 12 to get each employee's total annual salary. And so we are going to pivot those values. So just by dragging in all 12 of those columns from the left-hand side, let me quickly show you how to highlight all of them. So click the top one, hold down the Shift key and click the bottom one, and that allows you to drag them all as one group, just to save you having to drag and drop 12 times. And we'll just rename those values in our next clean step. So our numbers 1 to 12 are going to be our month, and our numeric field, our pivot 1 values, is going to be our salary. And then we're going to use an aggregate step to group on each staff ID and sum up their salary. You can see in some cases it does a bit of a strange thing to the rounding here. That's kind of like the floating point error. Very frustrating to kind of see that, but it's not changing the overall values if we were to round to say 2 decimal places. So it's not actually causing us too many issues, it just looks a bit ugly. So now we'll come on to calculate our max tax rate. So what is the maximum tax bracket that these staff members fall into? So that's with an if statement that we're going to calculate that. So we're going to say if the salary is less than or equal to 12,570, then they will have no tax applied or a 0% rate. Otherwise, if it's less than 50,270, then that will be a 20% rate, will be their maximum tax rate, and so on and so forth through that table that was in the challenge. And then that creates this field for us. So most people are in either the 40 or 45% tax bracket there. Very lucky. And then we'll work out how much tax they're paying. So we do this by calculating how much they pay in the 20% rate, how much is the 40%, and how much is the 45%. So let's start with the 20% rate. Why not? So if they're in the 0% rate, I know that we don't have any in this data set in the 0% rate, but let's still account for those values just in case our data set updates in the future. So they're paying 0 tax in the 20% tax rate. Otherwise, if we have the max tax rate being 20%, then we need to multiply by 20%, 0.2, the salary minus 12,570. So making sure that that first £12,570 that is earned is not getting that 20% tax rate applied to it. And then finally, for anyone else, we just need to be between those two values. So from £12,570 up to £50,270, 20% tax rate will be applied to that amount there. The rest of the earnings that are above 50,270 will have a higher tax applied to them. So that's how we calculate that field there. Next, we move on to the 40%. Gets slightly easier at this point. We say that if the tax rate is 40, then it's just the salary minus 50,270 that gets multiplied by 40%. If it's on the 45% tax rate, then it is that upper bound again minus the lower bound multiplied by 40%. And then making sure those 0% and 20% are not paying any 40% tax rate here, so else 0. And then finally, for the 45%, the only people who get charged this are those who have the 45% rate as their highest, and it is just simply the salary minus that value there times by 45%, otherwise 0. Cool. So now we've got all the different tax in all the different bands. So to get the total tax paid, we just need to add together these 3 columns. And we'll just do that in one calculated field. You might think that you might want to do the similar kind of technique where we pivot and aggregate again, but I would argue that because we calculated each of these 3 columns ourselves, it's very much a manual thing that we've done. We know exactly how many fields there are to add together. I would say that doing the total tax paid in this way would be perfectly fine. The reason we did it, the pivot and aggregate here instead, is maybe 12 fields is a bit much to do 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. But both come to the same outcome. So hopefully you enjoyed that first intermediate challenge, and thank you very much for watching.